Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss about conceptual database design using ER model. In our previous videos, we have learned certain fundamentals of the ER design, diagram components. Today we will see some of the specific considerations as to while designing which component based on the concept, which component of the ER diagram to be used. The considerations can be, should a concept be modeled as an entity or an attribute? Should a concept be modeled as an entity or a relationship? If it is a relationship, what are the relationship sets and their participating entities? Should we go for a binary relationship or ternary relationship? Should we use aggregation or can we do it without aggregation? All these are going to be certain consideration or otherwise a concept where clarity or depending upon the situation, one of the options has to be selected. So, let us go for entity versus attribute. Now, attribute is a simple property of a concept. There will be certain situation where when a concept is given as simple attribute, it may not serve the purpose. Let us see an example. Should the address be an attribute of the employee or an entity? Now, this depends upon what is the information that you want from the address. Does the employee has multiple addresses? If that is the case, having it as an entity, having it as an attribute will not serve the purpose. We want an entity so that multiple addresses can be stored to one particular employee. Similarly, do we want the retrieval of the employees based on the city or based on the state or based on the locality? If that is the case, address cannot be a simple attribute, rather I need to divide it into multiple attributes instead of having it as single address or represent it as an entity. So, similarly, we will look into another example. In this example, it is possible for an employee to work in a department for more than one period. So, for example, this relationship represents an employee working in a department. Now, there is a possibility that there may be internal transfers or an employee worked for a particular period, he left the organization, he joins back and works in that department again. So, in such situation, the from and to duration cannot be a part of your employee database or employee table where I do not have the facility to write two values. In such situation, we can go for the attribute, the duration from and to is given as an entity itself, this part if you see. So, the solution is introduce an entity set called as duration with two attributes from and to, so that you can record several values of the descriptive attributes for the instant of each relationship. So, whichever employee works there, serves there for more than one period, that data can be recorded in the durations table. Next, entity versus relationship. Now, the situation here is, should I use an entity or introduce a new relation itself? Look at this example. Here, employees work for departments and departments are allotted with certain discretion budgets. Now, when I talk in terms of this, if each employee or otherwise the employee, if he manages one department, this kind of diagrammatic representation, this kind of ER diagram will work fine, because I just have two attributes since when he is managing that department and what is the budget allocated, which can go into any of the owner entity. Now, when I say that an employee manages more than one department, in such situation, if the discretionary budget is sum of all the departments what he maintains, then there is going to be problems arising like redundancy or misleading. Redundancy is every department managed by that manager will have that same value repeated, budget. Misleading is I will not be clear about which department is allotted with which budget. Now, what is the solution in this particular situation? Now, we are going to introduce a ternary relationship there. This problem can be solved by introducing a new entity called as manager appointment. Manager appointment, and show a ternary relationship where each appointment as a manager of a department can be shown, can be represented in this particular table, and since when he is managing that and what is the budget allocated for that department can get into this particular thing. So, based on the situations and based on what is that we intend from that data, the implementation or the design will change. Coming to the next one, binary versus ternary relationship. Now, when do I implement a ternary relationship? To consolidate the ER diagram, I may go with ternary relationships, but sometimes depending upon what is the information I need to store or retrieve from it, the relationships may change. Let us take an example where we are talking about employees having policies which covers multiple dependents. Look at this, an ER diagram that models a situation in which employee can own several policies. Each policy can be owned by several employees and each dependent can be covered by several policies. When you look at this ternary relationship fits very well into it, where employee has policies and that covers dependents. But assume that I have an additional requirement where I say that a policy cannot be jointly owned by 2 or more employees, or I put a restriction that every policy must be owned by some employee. So, you should have a mandatory participation here, or each dependent entity is uniquely identified by taking the policy name in conjunction with the policy ID of the policy entity. So, when I look into this kind of a situation, a simple ternary may not satisfy. So, now what is the solution for this? The first constraint there can be implemented by adding a key constraint on policies with respect to covers. Okay? Second, because there we said it cannot be jointly owned, the first condition says it cannot be jointly owned. Now, next, the second requirement suggests we impose a total participation of policy, because we say every policy, each policy must be held by at least one employee. So, when I say total participation constraint, the third requirement forces us to introduce an identifying relationship. We say which policy or which dependent is going to get benefited from which policy. Now, who is the employee who is sponsoring that and which policy is going to benefit that. So, when we look into this, we can go for binary relationship. So, instead of ternary, binary relationship show better meaning here. So, look at this, we have that employee dependencies and policies, but the relationship is now changed instead of ternary to binary relationship. That is, employees purchase policies and in that policies they have added dependents. So, automatically the particular employee through a particular policy, the dependent is going to get benefited. So, instead of a ternary relationship which simply says the employee dependent and the policy is being covered, which particular policy covers which dependent can be clearly identified through this particular binary relationship. Now, the next, aggregation versus ternary relationship. Whether we can manage with a ternary relationship or we want a binary relationship to be considered as an entity so that we can define a relationship on this, because it does not allow relationship on relationship. Now, this again depends upon what kind of information you want to retrieve from the data or what kind of constraints you are implementing or imposing on the data. Now let us consider this particular example. Now generally when do we go for aggregation? The choice between using aggregation or ternary relationship is mainly determined by the existence of a relationship that relates to relationship set to entity set. Now consider this particular example. According to this diagram, a project can be sponsored by any number of departments, and a department can sponsor one or more projects, and each sponsorship is monitored by one or more employees. So when we talk in terms of this, the concept of projects sponsored by departments, the relationship department and project is considered as an entity because the employee is going to monitor it as a whole. Now, when I talk about this particular relationship, the concept of ternary or aggregation is a choice here. If at all I can manage it only with the relationship, if at all I say that the concept of until when he monitors is removed from this, then in that case I don't require aggregation at all. I can simply say the particular project has been monitored by employees. But when I say until, then it requires aggregation because I need to consider this as a whole. Because every department have multiple projects and a project may be owned by 2 or more departments. So when I talk about it, monitoring it becomes aggregation, or otherwise the relation between employee monitoring this whole relationship becomes a concept there. So based on what has to be done or how it has to be done. So if until was not there, it would have become a simple ternary relationship. But when I introduce this concept, it requires aggregation. So this is how few considerations has to be made when we are designing our ER diagram. Thank you.